The champagne glasses caught the light like diamonds, but nothing could hide the ugliness of what was about to unfold. I stood at the entrance of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel ballroom, watching my husband David's colleagues mingle in their designer suits and practiced smiles, the annual corporate gala, where careers were made, deals were struck, and apparently, wives were humiliated. I smoothed down my black evening dress, the one David had picked out specifically for tonight. "You need to look the part," he'd said, adjusting my necklace with the kind of precision he used when reviewing contracts. "These people judge everything." What he didn't say, but what hung in the air between us, was that I was already being judged and found wanting. The ballroom buzzed with the energy of power and money. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with white orchids and gold accents. Everyone looked like they belonged here, like they were born to navigate these waters of corporate politics and social climbing. Everyone except me. I caught sight of David near the bar, his laugh a little too loud, his smile a little too wide. He was in his element here, surrounded by colleagues who hung on his every word. Beside him stood Jessica Crawford, his boss, a woman who wore her authority like other people wore perfume, subtle but unmistakable. Her red lips curved in what passed for a smile as she leaned in to whisper something to David. Whatever she said made him glance in my direction, and for a split second, I saw something flicker across his face. Embarrassment? Shame? Or was I reading too much into it? The thing about being married to someone for 8 years is that you learn to read the micro-expressions, the tiny tells that reveal what they're really thinking. And what I was reading from David's face made my stomach clench with a familiar dread. I made my way toward the seating chart, past conversations about quarterly reports and merger possibilities. The women here moved with a confidence I'd never quite mastered, their designer heels clicking against marble floors like a drumbeat of belonging. They belonged to this world of corner offices and expense accounts, of power lunches and strategic partnerships. I was an outsider looking in, and tonight that feeling was stronger than ever. But as I approached the elegantly scripted seating chart, something felt wrong. The conversations around me seemed to dim, replaced by a buzzing in my ears. Other guests were glancing at me with expressions I couldn't quite decipher. Was that pity? Amusement? My fingers trembled slightly as I searched for my name among the carefully arranged place cards. Table 7, near the back. That made sense. David had mentioned we wouldn't be sitting with the senior partners. Just this year, he'd promised. Once I make senior associate, things will be different. I found table 7 and began scanning the place cards. Margaret Thompson. Margaret Thompson. Where was my name? And then I saw it, positioned right where my seat should be, in the same elegant script as all the others. Pathetic gold digger nobody. The words hit me like a physical blow. I blinked, certain I was misreading, but the letters remained the same. Someone had taken the time to order a custom place card, to have it printed in the same font and style as all the others, just to humiliate me. This wasn't a cruel joke or a moment of spontaneous meanness. This was planned, calculated, deliberate. The buzzing in my ears grew louder as I realized that the conversations around me had indeed shifted. People were watching me, waiting for my reaction. How many of them knew about this? How many had been in on the joke? "Oh my God, did you see her face?" The voice carried just far enough for me to hear. I turned to see Jessica Crawford approaching our table, her red dress hugging her curves like armor. Behind her trailed a small group of David's colleagues, their faces wearing expressions of barely contained glee. "I can't believe she actually came," whispered Tom Bradley from accounting, not bothering to lower his voice. "After everything." Still clinging to him? Jessica's voice cut through the air like a blade. Her smile was all teeth and no warmth as she gestured toward my place card. How pathetic is that? Honestly, Margaret, don't you have any self-respect left? The laughter that followed was like breaking glass. Sharp, brittle, cutting. I felt my face flush hot with shame and anger, my hands shaking as I gripped the back of the chair that should have been mine. The carefully constructed world I'd been trying so hard to fit into was crumbling around me, revealing the ugly truth underneath. David appeared at Jessica's shoulder, his face pale but his expression carefully neutral. This was the man I'd supported through law school, the man I'd believed in when he had nothing but ambition and debt. Now he stood there, saying nothing, doing nothing, while his colleagues tore me apart for their entertainment. "David," my voice came out smaller than I intended, barely audible over the cruel laughter surrounding me. "Did you know about this?" He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked away. That was answer enough. The humiliation was complete, total, crushing. Every insecurity I'd ever had about our marriage, about my place in David's life, about whether I truly belonged anywhere, came rushing back with devastating force. I was the wife who didn't quite fit, the woman who wasn't successful enough, smart enough, sophisticated enough for this world David inhabited. But as I stood there, surrounded by their laughter and cruelty, something else began to bloom in my chest. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that, but a cold, calculating fury that surprised me with its intensity. They thought they knew me. They thought I was just some pathetic gold digger clinging to a man who was clearly embarrassed by my existence. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I straightened my shoulders and picked up the offensive place card, holding it up for everyone to see. The laughter died slightly as they realized I wasn't running away in tears as expected. "How creative," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Someone put a lot of thought into this." Jessica's smile widened. "Well, if the shoe fits," she shrugged with practiced indifference. "Honestly, Margaret, everyone here knows what you are. At least now it's out in the open." "What I am," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. Around us, other guests had begun to notice the commotion, conversations fading as more people turned to watch the drama unfold. The thing is, they were right about one thing. They had no idea what I really was. For 8 years, I'd played the role of the supportive wife, the woman content to live in her husband's shadow, to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and respect he threw my way. I'd hidden my past, my accomplishments, my true identity, all in service of David's career and his fragile ego. But secrets have power, and I'd been keeping some very big ones. I glanced across the ballroom toward the head table where the senior partners and company executives sat in positions of honor. There, at the center of it all, sat CEO Jonathan Whitmore, a man whose empire spanned multiple industries and whose approval could make or break careers. A man who had no idea that one of his largest silent investors was standing in the middle of his company's ballroom, being humiliated by his employees. The crowd around me was still waiting for my reaction, still expecting tears or angry words or a dramatic exit. Instead, I smiled. Really smiled for the first time all evening. "You know what, Jessica?" I said, tucking the place card into my purse like a treasured keepsake. "You're absolutely right. It's time for everything to be out in the open." I turned away from their confused faces and began walking toward the head table, my heels clicking against the marble floor with newfound purpose. Behind me, I could hear David calling my name, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes following my progress across the ballroom. But I wasn't the same woman who had walked into this gala tonight. That woman had been playing a role, pretending to be smaller than she was, weaker than she was. The woman walking toward Jonathan Whitmore was someone else entirely, someone who was done pretending, done hiding, done being anyone's secret. The conversations around the head table quieted as I approached. Jonathan Whitmore looked up from his conversation with the mayor, his eyebrows raised in polite confusion. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying just far enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Mr. Whitmore, I wonder if I might have a word." He glanced at his companions, then back at me, clearly trying to place where he knew me from. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson," I said, extending my hand. "Margaret Thompson, though you might know me better by my maiden name, Margaret Phillips." The recognition hit him like a lightning bolt. His eyes widened, his carefully composed expression shifting from polite confusion to something approaching shock. Around us, the conversations had stopped entirely, the silence spreading outward like ripples in a pond. I leaned in closer, close enough that only he could hear what I said next, though my words would echo through this company and this marriage, long after tonight was over. "I'd check your stock prices if I were you," I whispered, my voice steady and calm. "You might find the market's response to tonight's entertainment quite interesting." Jonathan Whitmore's face went pale as the full implications of what I'd just said sank in. Margaret Phillips wasn't just some random name. It was the name on corporate documents, shareholder reports, the signature on investment deals worth millions of dollars. It was the name of someone who could make his company's stock price rise or fall with a single decision, and that someone had just been publicly humiliated by his employees. The color drained from Jonathan Whitmore's face as my words sank in. I watched him process the information, his mind no doubt racing through the implications of what I'd just revealed. The woman his employees had just publicly humiliated wasn't some nobody clinging to her husband's coattails. She was Margaret Phillips, one of his company's most significant silent investors. "Margaret Phillips," he repeated under his breath, and I could practically see the mental calculations happening behind his eyes. The Phillips Investment Group held substantial positions in Whitmore and Associates, enough to influence major decisions, enough to make or break quarterly projections. Around us, the silence stretched like a taut wire. Other guests at nearby tables had stopped their conversations entirely, sensing that something monumental was happening but not quite understanding what. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between Jonathan and me with growing confusion. "Perhaps," I continued in that same calm whisper, "you should also check who authorized tonight's creative seating arrangements. I believe you'll find it traces back to someone in your management structure who may have overstepped their authority." Jonathan's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the screen. I knew what he was seeing, the after-hours trading numbers, the subtle but significant dip that had started just as word of tonight's events began circulating through certain channels. The market was unforgiving to companies that allowed their investors to be publicly disrespected. "How?" he managed to ask, his voice barely audible. "How did I know it would affect the stock price?" I smiled, a real smile this time, not the practiced one I'd worn for 8 years of corporate events. "Because I've been watching your company very carefully, Mr. Whitmore. Every decision, every hire, every cultural shift, including the recent promotion of certain individuals who seem to have forgotten that respect is not optional in professional settings." His eyes widened as the full scope of my knowledge became apparent. This wasn't some lucky guess or random threat. I had been observing, analyzing, documenting. Every quarterly report, every board meeting summary, every personnel file that crossed my desk through various investment channels had painted a picture of a company slowly developing a toxic culture at its mid-management level. The music continued to play, the chandeliers continued to sparkle, but the energy in the room had shifted dramatically. I could feel eyes on us from across the ballroom, could sense David's panic as he realized something significant was happening at the head table. Jessica Crawford was probably wondering why her evening of entertainment had suddenly gone so quiet. "Mrs. Phillips," Jonathan said, his voice steadying as he shifted into damage control mode, "I had no idea you were... we weren't informed that you would be attending tonight." "I wasn't attending as an investor," I replied, glancing back toward the table where my husband still stood with his colleagues. "I was attending as David Thompson's wife, a wife who was just publicly humiliated by your employees for the entertainment of your other guests." The phone in his hand buzzed with what I assumed were urgent messages from his financial team. After-hours trading was brutal when institutional investors started making moves, and word traveled fast in our circles. By morning, every major financial news outlet would be analyzing why Whitmore and Associates had taken a sudden hit in extended trading. This is unacceptable," Jonathan said, his CEO instincts finally kicking in. "Mrs. Phillips, I want you to know that this company does not condone this kind of behavior. We'll investigate immediately and take appropriate action." "Will you?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like this kind of behavior has been not just condoned, but encouraged. The place card wasn't made by some random employee acting alone. It was coordinated, planned, approved. That suggests a culture problem that goes deeper than one rogue individual. Around us, the conversations had begun to resume, but at a much lower volume. People were straining to hear what was being said at the head table, and the tension was palpable. I could see David making his way through the crowd, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. Jonathan followed my gaze and spotted David approaching. "Is that your husband?" "For now," I said simply. Those two words carried the weight of 8 years of marriage, of support given and respect withheld, of a woman who had finally reached her breaking point. David had made his choice when he stood silent while his colleagues tore me apart. Now I was making mine. David reached our table just as Jonathan was rising from his seat. The CEO's body language completely transformed from the relaxed dinner host he'd been 5 minutes earlier. Now he looked like what he was, a man whose company was hemorrhaging value in real time because of his employees' actions. "Margaret," David said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "What are you doing?" I turned to face my husband, this man I'd loved and supported and believed in for so many years. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what was happening around him. Behind him, I could see Jessica Crawford hovering at the edge of the crowd, her confident smirk replaced by growing concern as she realized the conversation at the head table was about more than just a social complaint. "I'm having a conversation with Mr. Whitmore about company culture," I said evenly. "It seems there are some systemic issues that need addressing." David's eyes darted between me and Jonathan, clearly trying to piece together what was happening. "Margaret, whatever this is, we can discuss it at home. You're embarrassing yourself." The words hung in the air like a slap. Even now, faced with evidence that something significant was happening, his first instinct was to diminish me, to make me the problem. Jonathan cleared his throat, his business instincts overriding any personal discomfort. "Mr. Thompson, I think you may be misunderstanding the situation. Your wife is Margaret Phillips, correct?" I watched the confusion flicker across David's face. He knew my maiden name, of course, but he'd never connected it to anything significant. In his mind, I was just Margaret who worked in finance stuff. He'd never bothered to ask for details, never shown interest in the specifics of what I did during my days while he built his legal career. "Margaret Phillips of Phillips Investment Group," Jonathan continued, his voice carrying enough volume that nearby tables could hear. "One of our most valued institutional investors." The moment David's face changed was almost comical. 8 years of marriage. 8 years of him treating me like an accessory to his career. 8 years of assuming I was financially dependent on him, and he was only now learning the truth. The irony wasn't lost on me. All this time, he'd been the one married to money, not the other way around. "That's impossible," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Margaret doesn't... She never said..." "No," I agreed. "I never said. You never asked." The crowd around us had grown, drawn by the unmistakable energy of drama unfolding. I could see Jessica pushing her way through the gathering people, her face no longer showing amusement but something approaching alarm. Other partners from the firm were converging on our location, and I could hear phones buzzing with increasing frequency as word spread through the business community. Jonathan's phone rang, and he glanced at the caller ID before looking at me apologetically. "I need to take this. It's our head of investor relations." "Of course," I said graciously. "Crisis management is important in situations like this." As he stepped away to take the call, I found myself facing David in what felt like a spotlight, surrounded by his colleagues and their spouses, all of them slowly realizing that the evening's entertainment had backfired spectacularly. "Why didn't you tell me?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question was so fundamentally wrong that I almost laughed. "Tell you what, David? That I was successful? That I had money? That I didn't need you the way you assumed I did?" "Yes, all of it." "When?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet around us. When would have been a good time? When you introduced me to your colleagues as just my wife. When you told me I needed to know my place at firm functions. When you spent years making it clear that my only value was in how well I reflected on your career? Jessica finally reached us, her designer heels clicking urgently against the marble floor. She'd clearly overheard enough of the conversation to understand that something had gone very wrong with her evening's plan. "David, what's going on?" she demanded, but her eyes were on me, no longer dismissive, but calculating, trying to assess the threat level. "Jessica," I said pleasantly, "I was just explaining to my husband about the investment portfolio that includes significant holdings in Whitmore and Associates. You know, the company that just saw its stock price take a hit because of tonight's festivities." The color drained from her face as the implications hit her. Corporate lawyers understood liability, understood consequences, understood exactly what it meant when major investors started pulling support because of employee behavior. "You're lying," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. Jonathan returned from his phone call, his expression grim. "I'm afraid she's not," he said to Jessica. "That was our head of institutional investments. Apparently, word of tonight's events has already reached several major stakeholder groups. They're concerned about our company culture." The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, David's colleagues began to understand that they hadn't just participated in humiliating some random wife. They'd participated in a public relations disaster that could affect their careers, their bonuses, their futures. "There has to be some mistake," David said desperately. "Margaret, tell them this is some kind of misunderstanding." I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. He wasn't evil, just weak. Weak enough to let his colleagues humiliate his wife for their entertainment. Weak enough to prioritize his social standing over basic human decency. Weak enough to spend 8 years married to a woman he'd never bothered to really know. "The only mistake," I said softly, "was mine. I spent 8 years pretending to be smaller than I am, weaker than I am, because I thought that's what you needed. I thought if I made myself invisible, you'd shine brighter. Instead, you just learned to see me as invisible." Jonathan stepped forward, his CEO instincts fully engaged now. "Mrs. Phillips, is there anything the company can do to address this situation? Any way we can make this right?" I considered the question seriously. Around us the gala continued, but our small drama had become the center of attention. Other guests were openly staring now, their phones out, probably already sharing the gossip on social media. By tomorrow, this would be the story everyone in their industry was talking about. "You can start," I said finally, "by conducting a thorough review of your management structure, specifically how certain individuals have been using their positions to create hostile environments for people they perceive as beneath them." My eyes found Jessica, who was standing frozen beside David, probably calculating how much this would cost her professionally. "You see, the thing about being an investor rather than just an employee is perspective," I continued. "I see the bigger picture. I see how toxic management affects productivity, employee retention, client relationships. I see how companies that tolerate bullying and humiliation inevitably lose talent and market position." Jonathan nodded gravely. "We take these concerns very seriously." "Good," I said, "because I'll be watching very carefully to see how seriously. The Phillips Investment Group doesn't maintain positions in companies that don't align with our values like respect, dignity, and professional integrity." The threat was clear, elegant, and devastating. Not personal revenge, but professional consequences for professional behavior. The kind of measured response that carried real weight in the business world. David reached for my arm, a gesture that once might have been protective but now felt desperate. "Margaret, please. We can work this out. Whatever you need, whatever you want." I stepped away from his touch, creating physical distance that matched the emotional chasm that had opened between us. "What I want," I said clearly, "is to go home. My home. Which, as it happens, I pay for." Another revelation that hit David like a physical blow. The house he'd been so proud of, the mortgage he thought he was struggling to pay, the financial security he'd assumed was barely within their reach. It had all been mine, all along. I turned back to Jonathan one final time. I'll expect a full report on your findings within the week. And Mr. Whitmore, you might want to review your employee handbook regarding respect and dignity in the workplace. Some of your staff seem unclear on company policy. With that, I walked away from the head table, leaving behind the wreckage of 8 years of marriage and the illusion of powerlessness I'd maintained for far too long. Behind me, I could hear urgent whispered conversations, the damage control already beginning. But I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I was moving forward as myself, not as someone's wife, not as someone's secret, but as Margaret Phillips, a woman who had finally stopped hiding her light under someone else's bushel. The ballroom doors closed behind me with a soft click, shutting out the chaos I'd left in my wake. Tomorrow would bring consequences, conversations, decisions about the future. Tonight, I was finally free.